Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
A discussion of the November 2012 ballot propositions by the League of Women Voters, Cupertino, and Sunnyvale.
I'm Susan Huff from the League of Women Voters, and I'm here with Elaine Manley to bring you information about the upcoming election on November 6th. We won't be talking about the candidates, but about the statewide ballot measures. Maybe you've seen ads or received mailers, and you're wondering what to think about these proposed laws. It's not easy trying to decide whose claims to believe or how that balance of costs and benefits is going to work out. Ideally, by the end of this show, you'll know a little more about the issues and the trade-offs. So Elaine, let's start with the election calendar. When do we need to be registered for voting in this election?
Well, to vote on Tuesday, November 6th, you must be registered to vote by Monday, October 22nd. The registration deadline is always 15 days before an election, and you need to re-register if you've moved or if you change your party preference. You can find registration forms at any post office or DMV, at your library, or from your local League of Women Voters. In many counties, you can even download them from the Registrar of Voters website. Complete the form, mail it in, and bring it to the Registrar of Voters website. If you're not a permanent vote-by-mail voter, you have until October 30th to request a vote-by-mail ballot. But I wouldn't wait that long. Your ballot must be received by the Registrar of Voters by the time the polls close on Election Day. So you should probably mail your ballot several days in advance, say by the Friday before the election. However, you can also drop off your ballot at any polling place in your county on Election Day.
Okay, that takes care of the logistics of voting. What else do people need to know?
Well, I think people might like to know who we are and what we're trying to accomplish today. The League of Women Voters is actually two organizations, a nationwide member organization of women and men, and an education fund. Neither organization supports or opposes political parties or candidates, but the member organization does take positions on public policy issues. Members vote to study an issue, they collect the information, and they discuss it and come to a consensus. Then when the new laws are proposed, the League can compare the proposed laws with positions already established by the members and decide to support or oppose or remain neutral on them. The member organization has taken positions on some of the propositions that we will be discussing today. Although Susan and I are League members, we are not here to advocate on behalf of the League of Women Voters. Instead, we are here as a service of the League of Women Voters Education Fund to give an unbiased explanation of the propositions, including the pros and cons of each. We'll also let you know who has come out for and against the propositions, but since this tape is early in the election season, we're not going to give everyone who will support or oppose because we're not going to know. So we'll mostly be telling you who has signed arguments for or against a measure. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell the whole story, and the financial picture is changing steadily. At the end of this show, we'll be giving you some websites for updated information. Now on to the election. We have 11 propositions on the state ballot, and all of them need a simple majority to pass. So let's start with the propositions that focus on the California budget crisis. There are two measures on the November ballot that propose ways to increase revenue, but they approach the problem differently.
That's right. So Proposition 30 is often called the Jerry Brown tax plan. The other one, Proposition 38, people are calling the Molly Munger tax plan. Let's start with 30, the governor's plan. Proposition 30 is a particularly interesting one because regardless of whether the yeses or the nos win, there will be a change. And here's how that happens. Proposition 30 involves an increase in the state sales tax rate and a higher personal income tax rate for upper income taxpayers in order to bring in more revenue. Last June, the legislature and the governor adopted a budget for 2012-13 that assumes this measure will pass. The plan calls for spending the revenue on various state programs. It also guarantees that local governments continue to receive a share of state tax revenues that were transferred to them last year. Last year, the state handed over to local governments, primarily to counties, responsibility for incarcerating some adult offenders, for supervising parolees, and providing drug abuse treatment programs. And the state also passed a law requiring the transfer of about $6 billion of state tax revenues to local governments each year, that money paying for the shift of responsibilities. Proposition 30 would guarantee continued funding for that. Another big share of the Prop 30 revenues would go to schools and community colleges, about 14% more than they got last year, but almost all this increase would be used to pay K through 14 expenses from the previous year and to reduce delays in K through 14 payments. Schools and community colleges could use those funds for any educational purpose. So Prop 30 does bring in revenue, but there's no way that it solves California's budget woes. The current budget plan assumes those Proposition 30 revenues, but even counting on them, the current budget constrains spending in some health and social services programs, it decreases state employee compensation, and it does borrow from other state accounts. But if Prop 30 doesn't pass, then the backup budget plan kicks in with much deeper cuts. The backup budget plan requires that spending be reduced by $6 billion. This would trigger specific cuts, including $5.5 billion from education.
So if Prop 30 does pass, who would pay the increased taxes?
Everyone would pay the higher sales tax rate for 4 years. It's an increase of 0.25%. So if you're paying 8%, you would pay 8.25% sales tax. Upper income earners would pay higher personal income taxes for 7 years, where by upper income earners, I mean someone filing singly who has over $250,000 in taxable income, or joint filers with over $500,000 in taxable income. So as an example, if you're a couple, you're filing jointly with $700,000 in taxable income, you would pay about $3,000 more in personal income tax under the terms of Proposition 30. So who's in favor of Proposition 30, and what do they have to tell us?
Well, Governor Jerry Brown is center stage, and the measure has support from the California Democratic Party and some major unions representing school employees, public safety employees, and nurses. The California League of Women Voters also signed arguments in support of Proposition 30. The supporters say that Proposition 30 begins to move California toward financial stability and adequate funding for all the services that we want from our government. They say it's a part of a balanced approach to eliminating our deficit and also guarantees a stable source of funding for the local governments to pay for their new public safety responsibilities.
And what about the opponents?
The Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association argues that California is already a poorly managed state with a budget deficit and a tax and regulatory environment that drives businesses away. They're opposed to any new taxes at all. A differing opposing argument has been mounted by the forces behind Prop 38 on this ballot. They say that the initiative doesn't guarantee any new funds for schools. But let's talk about Prop 38. What does it propose to do?
Proposition 38 would raise personal income taxes on most California taxpayers from 2013 through 2024. Unlike 30, it doesn't involve any increase in state sales taxes. The money would be earmarked for K through 12 public schools, for child care and preschool programs, and for state debt payments. In initial years, schools would receive about $6 billion annually from the measure. The funds would be allocated to educational program grants, low-income student grants, and training, technology, and teaching materials grants.
Now you say most California taxpayers. Who exactly would pay the increases?
That would be all but the very lowest income bracket. You would not pay more personal income tax if you were a single filer with annual taxable income below about $7,300 or joint filers making twice that. Everyone else's marginal tax rates would increase on a sliding scale with each higher income bracket.
Okay. Could you give us some examples?
Sure. So say you're a single filer with annual taxable income above $45,000. You'd pay about $325 more in state income tax. If you're joint filers with annual taxable income of about $160,000, you'd pay about $1,800 more in personal income tax. And if you're that previous example, the couple making $700,000 taxable income, you'd pay about $11,600 more in personal income tax under Proposition 38 than you do now. So who's in favor of Proposition 38, and what are they telling us?
Molly Munger, an attorney and activist, is putting up the funding for Prop 38. Arguments are signed by the California State PTA and Education Trust West. The supporters say that Prop 38 would make schools a priority again by providing guaranteed funding to local schools based on enrollment, and that this money can't be diverted by the legislature or spent on raises.
And what about the opposition?
In general, the people who oppose Prop 38 are the same people who favor Prop 30, plus those who don't favor any new tax increases. California State Sheriff's Association falls in the first category, while the California Taxpayer Protection Committee falls in the second. They say that instead of reforming the system, Prop 38 is a massive tax hike that throws more money into an unaccountable bureaucracy and does nothing to reduce the deficit. Now, these initiatives are in kind of an odd competition. What happens if both of them fail?
Then the backup budget plan that we discussed before takes effect.
I see. And what happens if both measures pass?
If they both pass, and Prop 30 passes with a greater number of votes, then no part of Proposition 38 happens. If Proposition 38 passes with a greater number of votes, then the tax increase parts of Prop 30 and the additional funding for the budget would not take place. But any provisions of Prop 30 not related to tax increases, and there are some minor ones, would still go into effect.
Okay, so if Prop 38 gets more yes votes and prevails over Prop 30, would the trigger cuts that are in the backup budget still go into effect?
Yes, they would.
Okay, so which measure would raise more revenue?
The effective dates in the propositions are different from one another. And of course, we don't know exactly what sales volumes and levels of income will be. So it's not surprising that revenue estimates vary as well. For Proposition 30, the legislative analyst and director of finance estimate a revenue increase of $7 to $9 billion each year until 2019. For Proposition 38, they estimate $10 to $11 billion more each year until 2024.
All right, so what's next? Anything else as exciting as the budget?
Some of these others will have an effect on the budget too. For instance, Proposition 31, it proposes a 2-year budget cycle. So it would amend the state constitution so that every other year the governor would need to submit budgets for the next 2 years, with a possible budget update 1 year later. It would also require performance reviews of all state programs and performance goals in state and local budgets.
All right, is that all we need to know about 31?
No, 31 has multiple parts. One of its other features deals with the interaction between state and local governments. So under Proposition 31, if local governments make a plan for coordinating public services and they find there's some state law or regulation that gets in the way of carrying out that plan, they can develop their own procedures that are functionally equivalent instead, and to a certain extent, they can manage the money flow needed to do the job. That is, the state would give up some sales tax revenue to counties where the local governments make this kind of coordinated plan for service. It also sets limits on the legislature's ability to pass some bills. Basically, it says that anytime they're going to increase costs or decrease revenue, they need to identify where the money's going to come from for those changes. There are some exceptions. If there are bills that provide funding that's required by federal law or collective bargaining agreements, or that increase funding because of increased workload in a department. And almost all bills are required to be available to the public for 3 days before they can be voted on.
Is that it?
Not quite.
Okay.
Proposition 31 also allows the governor to decrease state spending in a fiscal emergency if the legislature doesn't act within 45 days. The governor still can't cut spending that's required by the Constitution or by federal law, though, and that is the majority of the budget. Things like school spending, debt service, some health and social services programs. So who's in favor of 31, and what do they say?
Well, signing arguments in favor, we see individuals rather than organizations, but the measure came from California Forward Action Fund. Supporters say that Prop 31 will force politicians to live within their means and give voters and taxpayers critical information to hold politicians accountable. They also say Prop 31 will not raise taxes, increase costs, or set up any new government bureaucracy.
And who opposes Prop 31, and what do they have to tell us?
On the con side, we have the California League of Conservation voters. the California Federation of Teachers, and the California Tax Reform Association. The Democratic Party has also taken an opposing stance. Opponents say this proposition adds complicated new rules, restrictions, and requirements to the Constitution, and that it will make government slower, more expensive, and less effective. They also say the measure will prevent the state from cutting taxes unless it raises other taxes or cuts programs, even if the state is running a budget surplus. All right, so what's next on the ballot?
Proposition 32 prohibits political contributions by payroll deduction. Now, it bans it for everyone, but unions are pretty much the only group that uses payroll deduction to collect funds for political campaigning, so it has very little effect on anyone else. It also bans both corporations and unions from making contributions to candidates. Independent expenditures, which might be in favor of a candidate but aren't formally coordinated with the campaign, would still be allowed. And finally, it limits government contractors' ability to contribute to elected officials who play a role in awarding their contracts. Who's speaking up on this one?
Well, the supporters include the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and the National Federation of Independent Businesses. They say it cuts the ties between special interests and politicians. Opponents include Common Cause and the League of Women Voters of California. They say real campaign reform treats everyone equally, but 32 was written to exempt thousands of big businesses. So what's up next?
Proposition 33 is on auto insurance, and it should look familiar. We saw a very similar initiative in 2010. Insurance companies are limited in the factors they can use to decide your rates. Currently, a company can offer a loyalty discount if you've been covered by them for a long time, but they can't offer you a different price just because you've always had coverage from somebody. If Proposition 33 passes, that will change, and a person who has continuously carried auto insurance with any company or series of companies might be quoted a lower rate than someone who has allowed their insurance to lapse. If the lapse is less than 90 days or it's due to military service or unemployment, the driver would still be treated as if he or she had continuous coverage, and a driver who has had some insurance coverage might be offered a proportional discount. Who's advocating for and against it?
Insurance companies are funding the measure, while arguments are signed by the California Department of Forestry firefighters, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. They say current law punishes you by taking away your discount if you seek better coverage from another insurer. On the against side, we see Consumers Union and the California Nurses Association. They say Prop 33 will raise rates on drivers with perfect driving records who stop driving for legitimate reasons like going to college or recovering from a serious injury or taking public transportation, and then return to the insurance market. All right, so what's next?
If Proposition 34 passes, the death penalty will be repealed in California, with all current death sentences changed to life in prison without possibility of parole. Since California passed its current death penalty law in 1978, about 900 people have received a death sentence. 14 have been executed, 83 have died of other causes, and 75 have had their sentence reduced by the courts. So the legislative analyst estimates this measure would save state and local governments about $100 million annually, although in the initial 4 years, the state would incur costs of about $100 million total in supplemental payments to local law enforcement agencies. Savings would come from shorter trials, lower court costs, and fewer appeals. The prison population would probably increase slightly, but there would probably still be a net savings in prison costs because of the elimination of special death row accommodations. What are we hearing about this now?
Well, both the supporters, League of Women Voters, and some prominent individuals in the criminal justice system, and the opponents, the District Attorneys Association, the California State Sheriff's Association, and some families of murder victims, they're both arguing that doing things their way will save money and be more just. All right, now while we're talking about criminal justice, what's on Proposition 35?
Proposition 35 more than doubles the penalties for human trafficking. That's where a person is coerced by force or by fraud to do work, often but not necessarily prostitution. It also expands the definition of trafficking. It requires sex offenders to provide their internet identification to police, and it directs fines to fund victim services. What do people say about this one?
Well, in favor, we see law enforcement groups, Planned Parenthood, and the Democratic Party, among others. They say it will protect children from sexual exploitation and hold traffickers accountable. On the against side is the Erotic Services Providers Legal Education and Research Project, and they say that the real goal is to gain access to asset forfeiture to benefit the endorsing law enforcement agencies and nonprofits. They also say that pimping is defined so broadly as to label the landlords of prostitutes as sex offenders. Now, still on the topic of law enforcement, Proposition 36 looks at 3 strikes. What will it do?
California's 3 strikes law provides that if a person has 2 or more serious or violent felony convictions, the sentence for any new felony conviction is a term of 25 years to life. Now, in some cases, the court can choose not to consider prior felonies, and then the offender would be sentenced to a lesser term than 3 strikes law would dictate. There are currently 9,000 third strikers in a prison population of about 137,000. What Proposition 36 does is it reduces the sentence from 25 years to life to twice the usual term for certain third strikers whose current offenses are non-serious or non-violent felonies. And it also allows many current third strikers to apply for resentencing. With the change in sentencing, some inmates would be supervised by county probation rather than state parole once they're out of prison. What are people saying about this one?
Well, the district attorneys show up on both sides of this one, with some prominent individuals signing for and the California District Attorneys Association signing arguments against. The supporters say that life sentences shouldn't be imposed for some non-violent offenses, and that violent repeat offenders wouldn't be released early, and that taxpayers could save over $100 million a year. Opponents say that the existing 3 strikes law works, while Prop 36 allows dangerous criminals to get their prison sentence reduced, and some criminals will be released from prison without parole or any supervision. All right, that's it for law enforcement this election. What else do we have?
Proposition 37 requires that foods sold at retail in California be clearly labeled as genetically engineered, or GE, if they've been produced partly or entirely through genetic engineering. Exceptions include ready-to-eat foods, alcohol, organic foods, and animal products from animals that may have been fed GE crops unless the animal itself is a product of genetic engineering. Use of the word natural is also banned on labels for GE foods. Regulation of the measure would be the responsibility of the Department of Public Health, and individual consumers could bring lawsuits for violations without having to demonstrate that they were harmed by any mislabeling. Who's speaking for and against this?
Well, among those speaking in support, we see organic farmers and the consumer watchdog. They say that consumers have the right to know what's in their food, just like consumers in over 40 countries around the world that require labels for GE foods, and that GE foods have not been proven safe for human consumption in the long term. Opponents include the California Farm Bureau and the California Taxpayer Protection Committee. They say that there is no scientific justification for labeling of bioengineered foods, and that Prop 37 is a deeply flawed measure that will create added bureaucracy and frivolous lawsuits. All right, so now what do we need to know about Proposition 39?
In February of 2009, the law changed to allow multi-state companies to have their choice. They could calculate their California tax obligations either on sales in California, that's called the single sales method, or on their California sales and property and employees. That's the 3-factor method historically used. So broadly speaking, a multi-state company headquartered in California will pay lower taxes if California uses the single sales method, while a company which has sales in California but most of its operations and employees in another state will pay less if California uses the 3-factor method. This proposition would change the sales tax calculation so that the single sales method would be used for all multi-state companies operating in California. This would result in about $1 billion a year more in tax revenue. For 5 years, the money would be divided up, half to a new clean energy job creation fund and the rest to the general fund. After 5 years, all of the money would be flowing into the general fund. And of course, when the general fund is larger, the minimum amount committed to education grows proportionally. I think I can guess who's for and against this one.
Arguments for are signed by Californians for Clean Energy and Jobs and the Los Angeles Business Council, and they say Prop 39 levels the playing field, making out-of-state corporations play by the same rules as California employers. They also say that the current arrangements let corporations pay less if they have fewer employees here, giving companies a reason to send jobs out of state. Signing against, we see the California Taxpayer Protection Committee and the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, who say that a $1 billion tax increase on job creators will result in the loss of thousands of middle-class jobs. They add that Prop 39 is a recipe for waste and corruption, spending up to $22 million on a new bureaucracy and special interest commission. All right, last one on the ballot. And Proposition 40 is a referendum rather than an initiative, right?
That's right. Proposition 40 is a referendum on the state Senate districts drawn up by the Citizens Redistricting Commission. The people who put it on the ballot really wanted not to use the new districts for the 2012 elections. And when the court ruled that even with their referendum qualified, the new districts would be used this year, the backers pretty much gave up. They couldn't take the referendum off the ballot, but they are no longer urging us to overturn the new districts. Just to be clear, if you want to keep the new districts, vote yes. If you want to redo the redistricting, you vote no on this one. That's all the propositions. Is there anything else we want to make sure people know about?
We'd like you to know that the League of Women Voters has speakers like us available before every statewide election. We make presentations on ballot measures throughout the community at libraries and churches, neighborhood associations, corporations, and other organizations. If you'd like to schedule a presentation for your group, go to the League of Women Voters of California website at ca.lwv.org. That's ca.lwv.org, and click on Find a Local League on the left-hand side, and your local League of Women Voters will be happy to arrange a speaker for your group. We will be continuing to make presentations up until Election Day on November 6th.
I'd also like to remind viewers about the League of Women Voters nonpartisan election information website. You can learn about everything on your ballot by visiting www.smartvoter.org and typing in your address. You can even find your polling place. Other good places to look for election materials: the Easy Voter Guide, found in libraries and community centers and at www.easyvoterguide.org. The Easy Voter Guide is printed in 5 languages, and all of those are available to download. VotersEdge.org offers records of who's giving how much money to which propositions. You know, sometimes the supporters and opponents of record are not the people pouring money into a campaign. That financial information can make for very interesting reading. The League of Women Voters Education Fund site, cavotes.org, has a host of useful links about registration, voting, and ballot measures. And finally, your local Registrar of Voters site has everything you ever wanted to know about local measures in voting in your area. But really, however you're going to decide, please look at your voting choices, read that ballot pamphlet, spend some time thinking about it, and then vote your priorities. Because it's we voters who collectively shape this society that we live in, and that is a job worth doing right.